Thank you. Just like with my students, one person answers, right? Well, welcome to this breakfast gathering of the Association for Social Economics. For those of you who are new to our association, feel free to ask some of us more about it or pick up some of the brochures and information we have. We are an association that focuses on issues of ethics and justice within economics. So this morning, I want to welcome you and start. We have some awards that we give out at our annual breakfast to some people who have made valuable contributions, both to social economics and to our association. And I'm going to begin this morning by turning the mic over briefly to Jonathan White, our past president, once removed, I guess it would be at this point, I think, to present two of our awards. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. The Thomas Devine Award was first presented in 1987. It's given annually to the member who has made important lifetime contributions to social economics. Previous winners have included Warren Samuels, Mark Lutz, Chuck Wilbur, John Davis, and many other illustrious members of ASE, including last year's winner, Julie Nelson. The 2014 recipient is Irene van Staveren, who received her MA and PhD degrees from Erasmus University in Rotterdam. Her dissertation was on poverty and Newtown development in Indonesia. She has actually volunteered as a Dutch language teacher for illiterate Turkish and Moroccan women in Rotterdam. She has worked in a number of professional positions, including researcher at the Netherlands Economic Institute. And by the way, if I make any mistakes, you'll be happy to correct them, Irene. She's worked as a researcher in the Netherlands Economic Institute, as a policy advisor in the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, on macroeconomic policy and gender, as associate professor of feminist development economics, as a senior lecturer in labor economics at the International Institute of Social Studies at The Hague, as professor at the special chair of economics and Christian ethics at Radboud University, and currently as professor of pluralist development economics in the International Institute of Social Studies at Erasmus. That's a huge career. Irene is the winner of various awards for her research already, for which includes 2 books on ethics from an Aristotelian perspective, 4 co-edited books on various aspects of ethics and economics and feminist economics. And am I correct in thinking you told us you have a new book coming out on the crisis of 2008? Is that? Economics After the Crisis, that's correct. She's the author of more than 40 journal articles and about 33 book chapters. What a tremendous career in social economics. Please join me in welcoming and congratulating Irene as the 2014 Thomas Devine Award recipient.
Sure.
Pretty heavy. Thank you very, very much. I feel so honored. It's a wonderful surprise. When I read that email that I was the recipient of the Thomas Devine Lifetime Achievement Award, I read it the second time and I thought, wait a minute, lifetime? Do people consider me that old? I thought such awards were given to dead people or near dead people. So I decided I take it as a recognition of my work and my ambitions. Unlike some of my grand proposals, the latest one was rejected in the final round because it was considered to be too ambitious. But I consider this award to be ambitious, to be bold, and to continue along my lines of work in the past. Indeed, it includes a textbook, Economics After the Crisis, that just came out, in which social economics features prominently in every chapter as the first theoretical perspective for teaching economics, because I think it's the most fundamental economic perspective to teach, because it's the broadest one and the most real world, real life perspective. So as a winner of this prize, I feel the responsibility to continue working along these lines, but also to be a representative of the Association for Social Economics in promoting the work we are doing as a collective, and particularly also to demonstrate the importance of social economics as perhaps not a theory, but an approach that is founded, that has a strong foundation in values, in social values, as a school of thought in a way. And I think we have been a bit modest. When I wrote this textbook and decided to start every chapter with social economics, I figured out that a lot of things that I find social economics often doesn't have that label. I actually think that behavioral economics is founded on social economics, but it's not recognized as such. So I think we should be a bit less modest, well, I plan to contribute to a more bold presentation of social economics and claim it as a school of thought of its own, claim a stronger position for it. So that will keep me busy for the rest of my lifetime, honoring Thomas Devine and the other shoulders of social economists I stand on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Irene. We're very proud to have you a member of our group. And now onward to the Ludwig Mies Service Award. Since 1983, the Ludwig Mies Service Award has been presented periodically to the person who has given exceptional service to the association. Previous winners have included wonderful advocates for ASE, including Ed O'Boyle, Pat Welsh, Dan Finn, Deb Figart, last year's winner, Bruce Petrowski, and other luminaries, many of them who are in the room this morning. And this year's winner is Martha Starr, whom many of you know well for her wonderful service to ASE. Martha received her PhD at Boston University, and her research has focused on various aspects of macroeconomics and social economics. From 1992 to 2001, Martha worked at the Board of Governors at the Fed. From 2002 until last year, she was at American University, where she served as Director of Graduate Studies. And despite her intense professional and research activities, Martha found time to serve as co-editor of the Review of Social Economy for 7 years, from 2006 to 2013. She also served as Vice President, President, and President-elect, and then President of ASE in 2012. She has served in numerous other ad hoc capacities for ASE. For example, she helped create and inaugurate the Summer School for Social Economics in Glasgow in 2012. And I have a little anecdote to say about that. We wanted to give the students a t-shirt to remember that experience. And I don't know, Martha, do you remember the t-shirt design issue? We went through, I don't know how many designs, but it was a lot. And Martha's swamped with PhD students, you know, breathing down her neck and administrative duties and all these kinds of things. And meanwhile, I keep coming back, Martha, help, Martha, help. And Martha came up with a great design, and that's one example, one little anecdote about, despite everything else, Martha always pulled through for ASE. So she's been a superstar promoter of our organization, and please join me in welcoming and congratulating Martha as the 2014 Ludwig Mies Service Award recipient.
Oh dear.
Yeah.
I guess we put the steps on the wrong side.
Probably the first social economist to receive an award for T-shirt design, but thank you, Jonathan. It's an extraordinary honor and privilege to receive this award. In my 20 years since receiving my PhD, there's no group of economists that I've more enjoyed working with. I think the originality in this room, the energy, the commitment to ethical values, and the broad approach to economics that social economics represents is truly unique, and I hope that I've managed to do my part, at least in part, to keep the community thriving and successful and vigorous with fruitful research going forward. So thank you very much. I'm still at American University. I'm on loan. I'm on leave to the Food and Drug Administration, but I remain a faculty member at American University.
And thank you, Jonathan, for that. Next, I want to welcome to the podium one of the co-editors of the Review of Social Economy, Bob McMaster, who is going to come and present several awards related to that work. One, sorry.
I hope.
Okay. I'll get my script right.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you're enjoying yourself. I'm presenting the Helen Potter Award, which was created and endowed in 1975 and is presented each year to a young, promising scholar of social economics for the best paper published that particular year in the Review of Social Economy. The award for 2014 goes to Peter Wim Zuthoff. Now, my apologies for my mispronunciation, who is based at the University of Amsterdam. He single-authored an article entitled Thinking Like an Economist, the Neoliberal Politics of the Economics Textbook. And that was published in the June issue of the 2014 volume of the Review of Social Economy. I'd like to just convey the nature of this piece by just conveying the abstract. So hopefully my eyesight will not fail me here. This article surveys 10 introductory economics textbooks to examine whether and how economics contributed to the rise of neoliberalism. So indeed, it's a very topical issue. It defines neoliberalism as a political rationality characterized by market constructivism. In contrast with conventional liberal approaches that viewed limited government as legitimized by the failure of naturalistic markets, neoliberalism constructs the market as norm and means of government. Economics textbooks overall have a liberal outlook, argues Zuthoff, as exemplified by Samuelson's classic. However, with three liberal subgenres, the imperfect market view, the free market view, and an institutionalist view. Not an original institutionalist view, I hasten to add. While the introductory textbook cannot be construed as an instruction manual for neoliberalism, the article nevertheless identifies two important neoliberal moments: the discussion of market-based forms of government and the rise of a new genre of principles textbook that urges students to think like an economist. The article concludes with novel insights on how economics may have contributed to the spread of neoliberalism. The in judging this, the editors of the review felt this was an outstanding piece that was wonderfully argued. In the best Hollywood tradition, yet again, when I present something, nobody is here to receive it. However, as I said last year, I'm more than willing to look after the check. And I think we should recognise Peter in the traditional manner.
Okay. Great, got it. And the other half of the dynamic duo, Wilfred Dalsma, the other co-editor of the Review of Social Economy, is coming up to present the Warren Samuels Prize. Thank you.
Good morning, thank you very much. Just to add to what Rob just said, Peter Wim has written the longest review of a submission I ever received as an editor for the last 10 years, an 11-page review.
Wow.
Now, whenever I will be, or one of my colleagues will be approaching you for a review of a submission that we have, don't send in 11 pages, please. It's much too long. Anyways, it's good to be here to award the Warren Samuels Award. We have started that award a couple of years ago, and the award is given every year to a paper which is obviously of high quality and which signifies the social economics approach best in any paper presented at these meetings, and not just ASE sessions, but any session at these meetings. Everybody can send in something to see if they can deserve this award. And it must also be a paper that is of significance across the different disciplines. So it shouldn't be focused just on economics, it should be significant across disciplines. And obviously, since we are ASE, ethics is among those, and indeed the winner of this year's award combines ethics and economics. So as I will be saying something about the paper, I would very much like to invite Rob Garnett, winner of this year's Warren Samuels Award, to come to the podium and receive his well-deserved award. And I must say that Rob has written a very forceful, novel argument, and I think persuasive argument in favor of, or arguing that we as teachers have an ethical duty to teach economics in a pluralistic way. And I think he's done so very forcefully. He presented his paper yesterday. I couldn't make it to it, I had other obligations. And I hate to now say the title of the paper because I just learned that you changed the title.
I did.
You did. Well, you will get the award anyway, so.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And of course.
And
yes.
of course.
This too. And something more.
Oh,
Something more. It comes with.
Congratulations.
thank you so much. I was not prepared to say anything, so let me be very brief and just say that the revised title in paper is After Samuelson, Liberal Education for Economists. And the gist of it is the overlapping interest that all schools of economic thought share in the intellectual freedom of our students. And I do think that heterodox economists and social economists in particular have been in the lead on this issue for a long time and have a continuing responsibility to keep pushing this agenda, which is very much an urgent matter for the profession and something which we have a lot to share with our mainstream colleagues and most of all with our students. And Warren Samuels was a hero to me. I'm a new member to this group, but as someone who's had their PhD for more than 20 years, I've always looked to the Rose Journal and to this group as a gathering point for lots of different streams of thought in the heterodox world, and as a very important group, and also as a recovering Catholic myself, a group that I felt some affinity with from the beginning. But Warren Samuels was a giant, and someone who embodied, as a scholar and as a teacher and just a generous academic, someone we all can admire, and I couldn't be more proud to have this award. Thank you very much.
And the association publishes 2 journals. We also have the Forum for Social Economics. And here to present the Patrick J. Welch Award is Wolfram Elsner, the managing editor of that journal.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, everyone. The Forum, the little sister, the younger sister of Rose, has had its Best Paper Awards for many years as well. It was called the Springer Award earlier. It's the second time that we award the Patrick Welch Award. So the name just was given last year. And again, Irene. We Northwestern Europeans among us speak out correctly, Irene, not Irene, of course, you know. So we're neighbors, more or less. Again, for the 2014 a Best Paper Award, the award committee, which is Aparna Mitra, Lynn Chester, and Hardy Hanapi from Vienna, have selected the paper of Irene van Staveren, Ellen Wepping, Arjan de Haan, and Roberto Foix. And the paper's title is The Last Mile in Analyzing Well-Being and Poverty, Indices of Social Development. And of course, it's again in the at the core and a part of the core of the work of the Institute, of Irene's Institute, the International Institute of Social Studies, ISS in Den Haag. And let me just briefly cite from what Aparna has written down for me. The paper broadens the scope of research for future scholars who are interested in conducting statistical analysis for the purpose of cross-country comparisons, as well as to formulate meaningful social policies. The paper focuses on 2 of the indices, namely interpersonal safety and trust and intergroup cohesion, by defining some of the relevant variables that can be used for statistical analysis. It has laid, in this way, the foundations for conducting quantitative analysis of the relationship between some of the social indicators and economic development. What better could be said for relevant social science research? Irene, a second time, come please up here and take the reward for the 4 of your suitcase will have overload, and you have to pay for it on your flight back. Thank you, and welcome me and the award for Irene and her co-authors. Thank you.
Well, so now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this morning, our primary speaker, Mark White, the outgoing president of the association, who's going to be speaking on judgment. Waters, I missed one. Oh, I am so sorry, Giuseppe. So, Giuseppe Fontana, I apologize, who is now president-elect of the association, is going to come up and present the William Waters Grant, and I apologize for getting ahead of myself.
Good morning to everyone. I took with me the computer, so I will not make mistake in pronouncing the name and the work of the two candidates that we thought were most deserving the grants this year. We had actually a lot of applicants, 25, and mostly very highly quality applicants. So it was really very difficult. And this is, in a sense, is good news because it means that there are young people working on teams that are very close and heart of association. And the two candidates, unfortunately, couldn't be here because the way it is worded, the grant, is that there is a very late announcement. But at least one of the candidates will probably attend the World Conference, so that's good news. So the first candidate that won the grant is Caroline Hossein. She's an untenured associate professor at York University, and the title of her research project is Canada Grow Well People, Understanding Canada Black Social Economy. And she was supported by Dr. Roberto Rice from the School of Languages and Literature at Guelph University and Dr. Russell Benjamin, Department of Political Science at Northeastern Illinois University. The second winning of the grant is Francisco Fernando de Castro. He is a graduate student at the University of California, Irvine, and the project is on conditional cash transfer and food poverty alleviation, the case of Oportunidades program in the city of San Luis Rio, Colorado, Sonora, Mexico. And got reference letter from Dr. Seth Pipikin from the Department of Planning, Policy and Design, University of California, Irvine, and the colleague Dr. Nina Brandelli from Department of Sociology. They were excellent application, and I'm sorry that they couldn't be here, but I said at least one candidate will be at the World Economic Conference.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, and for those of you not aware, the Waters Grant supports research by young scholars related to social economics. So, all right, so now I get to introduce Mark. Mark is, as I said, the outgoing president of the association and a longstanding member who's given a lot to the association, and many of us know him as an expert in Kantian ethics. He's a professor of philosophy at the College of Staten Island, but he does work in philosophy and psychology as well as in economics, so he is a true interdisciplinarian. But he also is an expert on superheroes and has published on the ethical lessons that we can get from understanding Batman and Superman and other superheroes. But one thing you may not realize is I think I've discovered from talking to his friend Jonathan White that in fact this interest may be because he is something of a superhero himself. I understand he never sleeps, which actually helps me understand how he can be so productive, putting out our blog and another blog and doing all the research and writing that he does. I suspect that he must be a little bit of a superhero himself. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Mark White, who's going to be speaking on judgment, balancing principle and policy.
Taller than Ellen. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Ellen, for that wonderful and very embarrassing introduction. Just to be clear, I am chairing the Department of Philosophy at my college, but my PhD is in economics. So, and I have no training in psychology, but have managed to contribute a little bit to that from time to time. Everyone can hear me? I'm never sure with microphones because I'm usually several feet above them. And what? It would be good to have a microphone. I do have one, don't I? I hear the echo. It's not me. Okay. All right. I'm very honored today to give the presidential address to my friends and colleagues in the Association of Social Economics. Today, as Ellen said, I'm going to be talking about judgment, Moral judgment in particular, which is an ongoing research project of mine. It's been included in several projects recently, including my much heralded work on superheroes. I'm getting ready to write a dedicated project to judgment, so this paper serves as sort of a preview or a preface of what that project will entail. So, as social economists, we know how rare it is to find ethical motivations represented in economic models. We see this problem in models of individual choice, in which agents are slaves to their preferences and constraints, and at best they pursue an enlightened self-interest with little mention of virtue or duty. We see it also in the areas of policy and regulation, in which government decision makers conduct cost-benefit analysis or attempt to maximize the social welfare function with little regard for dignity or justice. Many of us in this room, including Irina Van Staveren, Jonathan White, myself, and others, have explored different ways to work ethics into economic models in ways that challenge the status quo. Let's start with one particular approach, which Amartya Sen called commitment, and to which I'm going to refer as principle. Economists don't work well with principles. Mainstream economics likes to keep things measurable: prices, output, utility, income, even happiness. But principles are abstract ideals, concepts like justice and dignity and honesty, sometimes embodied in rules or duties such as respect others or do not lie. We normally think that principles have no price or that they transcend price. And if they do, that poses a serious problem for economists who think in terms of trade-offs and marginal rates of substitution. They would like changes in prices and costs to be reflected in changes in behavior and are skeptical when these changes don't affect final decisions. But what makes a principle unique is that it doesn't bend easily to cost. A promise is a promise, even if the cost of keeping that promise increases, at least by a small amount. Things may be different if the cost is high, as we'll see later, but in the world of small marginal changes, principles don't budge. Even in mainstream economics, however, principles have always been there, although they're usually taken for granted. In the models of supply and demand that many of us teach our introductory level students, we implicitly assume that buyers don't simply steal goods from sellers, and that sellers don't just take buyers' money and run. We assume that market participants follow basic rules of morality in their transactions, but we rarely acknowledge this except when we study specifically crime or corruption. These moral rules serve as constraints on market behavior and have a strong, under-recognized effect on the outcomes, an effect that we see all too well when actors in the real world forget or ignore these moral constraints. But principles and rules aren't everything. They're often too general or vague to apply to specific moral choices. To bridge this gap, we need judgment, an element of decision-making that is of critical importance to both ethics and economics, but remains underappreciated in both. So in my remarks this morning, I'll explore one conception of judgment that I've worked on, which combines the moral philosophy of Immanuel Kant and the legal philosophy of Ronald Dworkin. This theory of moral judgment can inform economics in two ways. First, it can improve on models of economic choice that already include ethical decision-making, and at the same time demonstrate the limits of these models, given the qualitative nature of judgment that defies precise formulation. Second, it can lead to a better understanding and execution and design of policy and regulation, two roles of government that require balancing of societal goals with core principles. So in order to see the necessity of judgment, we need to understand a little bit about how Kantian ethics works with economics. So I'm going to give you a 30-second summary of Kantian ethics. That's all you really need. Don't tell people I try to sell you a whole book, like me. Kant's ethics are based on the belief that human beings have a capacity for autonomy, which he defines as the ability to make decisions independently of external influence as well as internal influence. In other words, the ability to do the right thing regardless of authority, regardless of peer pressure, and regardless also of our own desires. While this autonomy is never absolute, none of us have it perfectly, the potential for it lies within each person, and that potential grants us each a dignity, an incomparable and incalculable value that differentiates persons from mere things. Out of this recognition of the equal moral status of all persons, a rational person must behave ethically towards each other in a way determined by the categorical imperative. I'm not going to talk about the categorical imperative, don't worry. A formulation of the moral law that generates duties. Okay? So many people get stuck on Kant's categorical imperative. It's actually the least significant part of his work, in my opinion. To be truly moral, this is more important than the categorical imperative. To be truly moral, people must act not just according to duty, but for the sake of duty. It's not so much the action that's ethical, but for the person to be ethical, actions must be performed for the right reasons. Now, without talking about the categorical imperative, the duties that result from it can be categorized as either perfect or imperfect. Okay. Perfect duties are usually negative in nature, such as do not steal and do not lie, and they serve to foreclose certain actions that violate the dignity or fail to respect the autonomy of other persons. They're also called strict duties because they admit of no exceptions in the interest of inclination or preferences. We can't set them aside just because we don't want to do them. Imperfect duties, on the other hand, are usually positive, such as help others, cultivate your talents, and they mandate attitudes that must be maintained rather than specific actions that must be taken or avoided. Okay, so the duty to help others doesn't mandate that we help a particular person at a particular time. For this reason, these duties are also called wide duties, and their dictates can actually be balanced with other goals and preferences. For example, the duty to help others does not specify exactly when or how to help others, only that the agent should help others when it's not a significant burden, such as Peter Singer's famous example of bending down to pick the drowning toddler out of a shallow pool. Note that the flexibility of imperfect duties already invokes the need for judgment to tell us how to translate this very wide mandate into specific action in specific circumstances. The surprising thing may be that this is actually true of perfect duties as well, because perfect duties tell us what not to do, but they don't tell us what to do instead. So for instance, the duty do not lie doesn't say we have to be completely forthright. We just can't be deceitful. We can keep quiet, we can change the subject, we can walk away, look squirrel, and do any of those things. As it happens, conveniently for me, who wrote on it, perfect and imperfect duties in Kantian ethics correspond fairly nicely to constraints and preferences in the standard traditional mainstream economic model of choice. Since perfect duties forbid certain actions, they limit choices in the same way that traditional resource constraints do, albeit a little more specifically. And because imperfect duties specify certain ends that must be sought, they can coincide with preferences, with our ordinary idea of preferences in the ranking, including self-interest. So when perfect and imperfect duties are included in this way, assuming the agent adopts the duties for the right reason, which is kind of a background assumption, she makes decisions to satisfy her quote-unquote preferences within her quote-unquote constraints, and therefore satisfies the basic tenets of Kantian ethics. Okay, so that's the quick overview of basically what I wrote up in my book on Kantian ethics and economics in the very beginning. But this is where judgment comes in. While identifying duties is easily done in the abstract, it's far from clear exactly how they're translated to action in specific choice circumstances. This is not a fault of Kantian ethics or deontology in general, but rather a problem with all basic systems of ethics that you learn in your introductory philosophy class. These schools of ethics provide simple guidelines or rules of thumb, such as do not lie, maximize total happiness, be a courageous person, which cannot be applied directly to specific moral dilemmas. I love Deidre McCluskey's categorization of this as ethics by 3x5 card, as if you can just carry something around in your wallet or purse that lists the basic rules and this is what I do in this situation. Okay, you can't do that. What these rules and guidelines provide is a framework with which to identify the most moral salient aspects of a situation and use that as a beginning point to decide what to do. To decide what you actually are going to do, that requires judgment. Now, virtue ethics, which avoids specific rules and formulas in favor of endorsing general dispositions or character traits, has long emphasized the importance of practical judgment in decision-making. Aristotle emphasized it in his concept of phronesis. In general, though, utilitarians and deontologists have not emphasized the critical role of judgment to quite this extent. Deontologists, with one prominent example that I'll talk about later, can be too confident in their rules and duties, often presuming that if one toes the line of absolute right and wrong, any ambiguity in moral action will be eliminated. Utilitarians on the surface would seem immune from ambiguity, at bottom, utilitarian decision-making appears to be a math problem, such as we'd hear in the other hotel. But that is merely the final step in a lengthy process that requires judgment at every turn. It begins when the utilities themselves must be assigned, and continues with how broadly the effects of actions will be estimated, and how far ahead in time, and estimations of the probabilities of future contingencies. It makes no sense to compute every effect on every person possibly affected in every state of the world. So the utilitarian must make judgment calls to determine how far they're going to forecast and how broadly they're going to forecast effects of their choices. The simplicity of the final calculation masks the enormous amount of ambiguity in the utilitarian decision-making process. The process of deontological decision-making, according to rules and principles, has the opposite problem. It's very easy at the beginning. You just identify what you can't do or what you have to do or what principles you can't violate. But at the end, you might end up with so many principles applying to a situation, you need judgment to sort them through and decide which one you're going to favor. That's the type of judgment I'm going to focus on in the rest of the talk. Now, the exception that I mentioned to this general characterization of deontologists as simplistic in their thinking, of course, is Immanuel Kant, who acknowledged and indeed stressed the need for judgment to apply general duties to specific circumstances. And I'm going to have a few quotes in a row here. As he wrote, "To be sure, these laws require a power of judgment sharpened by experience, partly in order to distinguish in which cases they are applicable, and partly to gain for them access to the human will as well as influence for putting them into practice." And in fact, he had very harsh words for those who would try to rely on simple rules alone. "Dogmas and formulas, those mechanical instruments for rational use or misuse of men's natural endowments, are the ball and chain of his permanent immaturity." Whoever thinks Kant was a boring writer hasn't read enough of him. Okay? As Kantian philosopher Honora O'Neill recognizes, discussions of judgment are ubiquitous in Kant's writings. He never assumes agents can move from principles of duty or other principles of action to selecting a highly specific act in particular circumstances without a process of judgment. While Kant full knew well that judgment was necessary to bridge the gap between what you aren't allowed to do and what you will do, he was silent regarding exactly how this was to be done. He emphasized the intuitive nature of judgment. Another quote, "Though understanding is capable of being instructed, judgment is a peculiar talent which can be practiced only and cannot be taught. It is the specific quality of so-called mother wit, and its lack no school can make good." So he said nothing specific about what form judgment would take after you've processed all the duties and obligations and principles. As another Kantian philosopher, Roger Sullivan, put it, "Through simply living, facing ordinary moral problems day by day, we all accumulate a store of moral experience to help us judge how to act. We all develop some sensitivity to the features to which we should attend." Another Kantian philosopher, Barbara Herman, has written a lot about judgment as moral salience, being able to pick out the relevant moral aspects of a situation to help apply the duties and principles. Kant was silent on another thing too, which is indicative of how he considered it. He was silent on what agents should do when facing conflicting obligations. Okay, what I talked about before, when you have many duties or principles operating on you and they seem to pull in different directions. Here's an example. Let's say you promised your friend you'd celebrate his promotion with him, but just before leaving for his home, your mother calls and says she needs your help. I'm loading this up because it's your mother. Okay? You have two obligations, each based on a general duty to keep your promise, to help your mother. But in the end, there can only be one duty, your mother. But which? Kant merely said that the duty is indicated, the one duty arising from the conflict between these obligations, by, quote, "the strongest ground of obligation," end quote, end of story. He didn't say any more, that's it. Okay, he moved on. Why? He didn't say anything more. This is a topic that he emphasized so much throughout his writing. Why didn't he say more? And it seems a critical issue. Why did he ignore it? Now, some people thought that maybe strongest ground of obligation meant something in the terminology of the day that we've forgotten 200 some years later. Okay, they can't find any evidence of that. Maybe it was just a mistake of a brilliant mind, assuming that people know what he's talking about, and he moved on, had better things to do. That could be. Okay. I think, and I'm not alone in this, that he implied that this is where judgment takes over. Okay, you have these two conflicting obligations. They each have some importance, okay, but you needed to use your judgment. His duties that came out of the categorical imperative were just guidelines, just to help guide your moral intuitions. Okay, the rule of moral intuitions is very much under-recognized in Kant. Okay. Also, he never conceived of duties or obligations as being more or less important, or some having priority over another. They're qualitative issues of right and wrong. Okay, you do not lie, you do not steal, you keep your promises, etc. But at the same time, he was not immune to the concept of trade-offs. I mean, when he talked about imperfect duties and how they can be traded off against your inclinations, your self-interest, your naked self-interest, he used almost perfect optimizing language like a neoclassical economist would use. He said you don't have to sacrifice all your time and all your resources to helping others. He's been caricatured by some as being this ultimate self-sacrificing altruist. He wasn't. Because if you have to care and respect for humanity, you're also a member of humanity that deserves that equal amount of respect. So he knew implicitly that hard choices would have to be made. But he also said there's no clear formulaic way for doing so. There can't be rules to settle a conflict between rules, or those rules will conflict with other rules, and you end up with an infinite regress. Sometime the rules have to stop, and you just have to figure out the answer for yourself. Okay? That's where my idea of judgment is going to come in a minute. Okay? So as the various philosophers I quoted so far said, duties and rules only get us so far. After that, the choice is ours, and making that choice depends on judgment. Perhaps most controversially, when discussing this with Kant scholars, and actually I've been amazed because the Kantians that I explain this to are not surprised or alarmed. The philosophers who have a casual passing knowledge of Kant are alarmed. So I feel fine with that. Okay. Perhaps most controversially when discussing Kant, judgment between conflicting obligations opens the door for the relevance of consequences as a moral consideration. This is for the people who think of Kant as being this strident anti-consequentialist, which is inaccurate at best. Consider a police officer pursuing two thieves down an alley. Okay, the alley ends at a T, one thief runs each way. Okay, the officer has an obligation to catch each, but obviously can only pursue one. What does she do? Okay, she doesn't have a greater duty to pursue one versus the other. Okay, if there's no reason based on duty or principle to pursue one versus the other, she has to make a choice. At that point, consequences, I think, even according to Kant, consequences can play a role. She can think about which one of them has the stolen goods, okay, which one of them may be the leader, or which one of them has information that would lead to a further prosecution, or simply which one is slower, and which one is she more likely to catch. Okay, all these are some principle and duty in each of these, but they're also very consequentialist notions. And I believe that even in a pure Kantian framework, consequences can play a role at this secondary level. The officer assessed her duties first, found no answer in duty, went to consequences second. I think that's perfectly valid within Kant's system. Like I said, Kant scholars say, yeah, sure. And then the casual Kant people say, no, that's not what I learned in Philosophy 101. Oh, that's all right. Okay, so enough about Kant for now. Never enough about Kant, but enough for now. Is there anything more definite we can say about this process of judgment, other than just saying it's mother wit, it's intuition, it's learned through experience? Is there any at least rough framework we can give it to help people know what they should consider and how they should consider them? I think there is. And it comes not from me, but from a legal philosopher named Ronald Dworkin, who unfortunately passed a couple years ago. He also wrote about making non-formulaic judgments in hard decision-making situations, although the context of his work was the decision-making of judges. His theories of jurisprudence fit very well into the lacuna left in Kant's description of judgment, offering a framework in which to make hard choices without reducing these choices to numbers, formulas, or yet more rules. Like Kant's ethics, Dworkin's judicial decision-making is based on principles, the proper domain of the judiciary. In legal terms, in Dworkin's terms, principles are timeless ideals that ground a legal system, such as justice, equality, etc., and are located in foundational documents, history, and traditions, as well as more contemporary legal materials, such as judicial precedent. This is contrasted with policy, which is based on the collective interests of members of society as deliberated by their elected representatives on behalf of their constituents. Ideally. Yeah. I always had to say it to my students, because I say something like that and it spins off as this great civics lecture, where our elected representatives portray our interests in a self-interested and civically minded way, and then they all just stare at me, and I say, ideally, so maybe you're more optimistic than they are, I don't know. While the goals of policy can change as the makeup of the population changes, demographics, opinions, and don't have to be consistent over time. I mean, the general thrust of policy changes as the party in control in either Congress or the presidency changes. That's fine. The principles, the core principles that ground legal and political decision-making have to be constant over time, though they can be interpreted differently. Okay? In fact, Dworkin conceives of a nation's legal principles as forming what he calls a seamless web. And when a judge makes a decision in a hard case, he or she must arrive at the, quote, right answer. The answer that fits into the seamless web, consistent with the other legal principles as that judge sees them, so this is a matter of personal interpretation, and maintains the integrity of the legal system as a whole. Okay? So I use the metaphor with my students of a wiffle ball. Are you familiar with a wiffle ball, plastic baseball that kids play with, hollow but little holes in it? So the principles in law form a seamless web. It's kind of like the wiffle ball, and when judges make new decisions, they're filling in a little bit of the holes. Okay, so it maintains the integrity of the ball while filling it out. Just as Dworkin's conception of jurisprudence is most useful in hard cases, where there's a lot of conflicting principles and no clear written statement on how they should be reconciled, I believe it can also work within Kantian decision-making in instances of conflicting obligation. As Dworkin's judge does, a person confronting a moral dilemma with no clear answer based on simple duties or principles must find what she considers to be the right answer, then it maintains the integrity of her personal moral character, the core values and principles that she holds dear. Consider the example from earlier in which a promise to a friend stands in the way of helping your mother. You have an obligation and presumptive duty to each, but you can only fulfill one. According to Kant, again, the strongest ground of obligation must pick out the duty, and only judgment can settle this matter. So you must decide which obligation is more important to you, given your basic moral principles and values. And since different people have different essential moral principles and values that go even deeper and more personally than duties and principles, even though different people may recognize the same values but interpret and balance them differently, they may make different choices in that situation. Say you have one person who is very close to her family and only had casual friends. Okay, that person in this conflict is obviously going to help her mother. Say you have another person who had a very tenuous relationship with her family, feels betrayed by them, abused by them, possibly true cases of abuse, and has found the only connections in their friends. Then we may not be so quick to favor, you have to help your mom. Okay? So they both people may realize the same basic obligations, but obviously they're going to weigh them differently because they feel what Kant said, a stronger ground of obligation to one or the other, which can be interpreted in many ways. This also explains split decisions in judicial opinions. Okay, we have on the Supreme Court, we have 9 very competent, very knowledgeable people with different views about the law. They consider the same facts, the same principles, and they come to different decisions, not because one knows more than the other, but because they value different aspects of the American legal system differently. They interpret the legal system differently. Even when they come to unanimous decisions, they may have made those decisions for 9 different reasons. Cass Sunstein has made this point often, and let's not celebrate the stream of unanimous Supreme Court decisions too much, because it doesn't mean that they're all kumbaya of one mind. Now, some would say that the answer to this puzzle, back to the, helping, keeping the promise to your friend or helping your mother, is simple. And I have heard this from Kant scholars. Keep the promise because that's a perfect duty, and perfect duties come before imperfect duties like beneficence and helping. Flexible duties, in other words, must bend to the inflexible ones. We all do that with time scheduling. We have certain things we need to do at certain times, other things that are less demanding in terms of time, so we slot things in. Okay, very practical. I don't believe Kant ever said this, even though I've been told he did. I don't think he did. And for good reason. Because whether a duty is strict or wide or perfect or imperfect has nothing to do with the substance of that duty that, according to Kant, is what settles obligations. So even though keeping your promise is a perfect duty, we have to consider the nature of what that promise entails versus the nature of the beneficence we owe other people and to whom we owe it. If you make the promise more trivial, I think in my original example it was helping your friend celebrate his promotion. That's a big deal. Okay? Let's say the promise is to return his DVD. Okay, I promised a friend I'd return a DVD I brought on the trip, I give it back to him on Monday. Okay, that's a promise, I have to keep it. But if my mom needs a ride to the hospital for critical surgery, I'm going to do that. Okay, I think we would all do that, unless you really love DVDs. Okay? So, like I said, you have an obligation to both. I don't think the fact that one is perfect or strict necessarily implies that that is, for some reason, lexically the most important one. Okay? And furthermore, if we want to get technical, Kant said that perfect duties are strict, only, admit no exception for inclination and preferences. It didn't say that it admits no exception for other duties, and obviously they have to. Okay? Looking at the substance rather than the form of an obligation also solves Kant's infamous murderer at the door problem. I imagine some of you have heard about this. It's something he wrote later in his life in a popular magazine, an irate reply to a commenter, where the situation was your best friend comes up to your house and says, bangs on the door frantically, says, someone's trying to kill me, you have to hide me. So you hide your best friend, shove him in the closet. 5 minutes later, the presumptive murderer shows up at the door. You know who this person is, you know what this person means to do, and says, where is your friend? Kant said, you must tell the truth to the person that designs to kill your best friend, because that is the perfect duty. That is the more important duty. And though your friend may die, your hands remain clean. This is disgusting. Okay? Again, I don't want to excuse it based on the fact it wasn't written in one of his eminent ethical works. It was written in a popular magazine or newspaper of the day. Someone offended him. He lashed back. That's not an excuse. He still stands responsible for what he wrote. But I think it's reasonable to regard this as a mistake. It's an inconsistency with the vast bulk of the rest of what he wrote. And in my opinion, philosophers are much too hesitant to call out mistakes in systematic philosophers who wrote thousands of pages where page 1 isn't necessarily going to correspond with page 7,000 at the end of their life. Okay, thought develops, even though this was a statement near the end of his life, so we usually privilege those. I don't think we have to. Dworkin actually was very firm on this, because when he talked about judicial decisions and identifying certain judicial decisions as mistakes and overruling them, he said that, the ones that don't fit into the seamless web, the ones that aren't consistent with the rest of the principles. We can do the same thing with a philosopher's work and say this one thing that this person wrote is not consistent with the rest. And that would save a lot of trees that philosophers have cut down and processed into paper, trying to show through convoluted logic how either this is correct, you shouldn't lie to the murderer, or that lying to the murderer in this case would be consistent with the categorical imperative. You can do it. It's very clever. It's very, nice logical tricks. But the main issue is, if we pay attention to Kant's voluminous writings on judgment and conflicting obligations, I think it's fairly easy to see that if he had thought about this a little more, he would have seen that the more important duty is to save your friend's life. not lie to the person who wants to kill her. Just, okay. Enough about that. I was going to say I'd get off my soapbox now, but that's what I'm up here for. So, okay. Enough to work and bring this back to economics. What does this have to do with economics? It sounds like a philosophy talk up till now, and it has been. Okay. Why is judgment important for economics? As I said in my opening comments, judgment can make contributions to our understanding of individual choice as well as policymaking regulation. So I'm going to talk about those two in turn. Okay, individual choice. Including any new conception of ethics into economic models of choice expands their explanatory power, and incorporating judgment does so to an even greater degree. It enables us to describe behavior driven by a mix of principle, preferences, and costs in ever-changing and context-sensitive ways, and also shows us the limitations of formal modeling of behavior with complex and hidden motivations. This role for judgment applies directly to the hybrid Kantian economic model of choice I described earlier, in that duties must be reconciled somehow with the standard constraints and preferences in the model we mix them up with. Now, perfect duties usually don't need to be ranked. Most people cannot kill, not steal, and not lie at the same time. So they will sit along traditional resource constraints and limiting the pursuit of the agent's other goals. Okay, just as budget constraints limit how much we can spend, other constraints limit how much we can lie, steal, kill, which is not to. Judgment is invoked directly and more importantly in the ranking I mentioned earlier of imperfect duties and other preferences, including self-interested and altruistic preferences. So you have to decide, would you rather, you have an extra $100 to spend, would you rather spend it on a new jacket? Or would you like to devote it to a charity to feed the homeless? Or perhaps purchase a foreign language course to, enrich yourself, which is also an imperfect duty. Now, economists have long included altruistic preferences in their models. Okay, so this isn't new. But they're never that clear on how exactly those are to be ranked or combined, except with usually recourse to some over-inclusive and vague sense of utility or payoff, which doesn't coincide with the Kantian view in which duties must be performed for their own sake and aren't quantified. So the model of judgment based on Dworkin's jurisprudence that I outlined doesn't necessarily make this ranking any clearer, but provides a little more guideline for how it would be done, and also points out that it can't be done formulaically. One of the most important and practical ways that judgment can add nuance to discussion of individual economic choices and ethics is when principled action is very costly. Okay? For example, say you have a person, say it's one of you, who holds lying to be just absolutely wrong. Okay? Which is fairly virtuous. Okay? And maintains a strict principle against it. But nonetheless, there could be circumstances where even that person may be convinced that that principle has to be compromised. Okay? One can imagine a parent lying about his college degree to get a job that will provide the premium health insurance that his sick child needs. A strict deontologist, or Kant when he's off his nut, may cross his arms and say, absolutely not, you can't do that, forget about it. Okay? But a more nuanced deontologist, such as Kant in the vast rest of his work, would say that this principle might have to bend to this other principle of beneficence, or specifically parental responsibility. Okay? This approach also casts doubt on the apparently noble practice, and I love nobility, so it kind of hurts me to say this, of standing on principle despite enormous costs, especially when those costs are incurred by other people. Okay? Here's an example drawn from a popular legal drama. A man is serving a lengthy prison term for a crime that he steadfastly claims he did not commit. He is a model prisoner and is encouraged to apply for parole, but because he refuses to admit his guilt, he cannot be released. Our impression of him based on this may be of as a fine man of principle. He's not going to compromise his own integrity, reputation, good name, just for the sake of getting out of prison. Okay, we may see him as heroic. Okay. But right after we see that, we see his family. his wife, his small son, who urgently want him back home. Okay? His son begs him, just say whatever you have to say, Dad, and come home to us. Father, also in tears, explains that I just want to make a good example for you, son. I want to show you that a person's name means a lot, and your integrity and honesty, and don't say just whatever you have to say to get out of a bad situation. The son probably understands this. Lesson learned. Now come home, Dad. Okay? So whether or not you agree with this man's decision, I'm not saying it's obvious one way or another. Okay? But this single-minded devotion to a single principle, regardless of other principles that enter the situation, especially principles that involve harm to other people that don't impact you directly. Now, obviously, seeing your son cry in front of you is going to impact you, okay? But it's all too easy. You think about politicians spending other people's money for their own pet projects. It's easy to ignore costs when they're borne by other people. Okay, which definitely isn't principled. So this is just another example where, even the most steadfast adherent to principle and right has to acknowledge that it's not just one or the other. It's not just principle versus cost or principle versus self-interest. It's often principle versus principle, where you have to decide which one is more important in a particular situation. Now, opening the door for opportunity cost, in the very general sense, which can include a foregone alternative principle. Opening the door for that to influence principled decision-making does not imply, it cannot be reduced to, the idea that moral behavior can simply be priced, like other activity and other purchases. If a person decides in a particular case that maintaining a principle is not worth the cost, this does not imply a fixed general price for that principle, because judgment is intensely contextual, and the person may not make the same judgment in a different situation. Okay? Or the same person in the same situation, or a different person in the same situation may make a different choice because of their different underlying basic values and principles. Furthermore, the person who chooses cost over principle does not abandon the principle altogether. We think of trade-offs. If I order the chicken, I don't order the beef. Okay? None of us are suffering over that decision. Okay? We realize we can only order one sandwich. I ordered the chicken, I gave up the beef, but I wanted the chicken more. I'm fine with that. I forget about the beef. But if you're going to sacrifice a principle because the costs are too high, whatever form those costs may take, this is a choice you make with regret. Okay? This isn't just a sandwich you decided you didn't want. This is a principle you believe in, but for some reason you cannot maintain it because the costs or alternative principles are just too important. Okay? You regret not making the choice, but being forced to make the choice at all, being put in that position. Consider the man in prison who more than anything else wants to be with his wife and child, but just cannot bear the thought of admitting to a crime he didn't commit in order to do it. We philosophers call these tragic dilemmas. Sophie's choice is the obvious example. You have to make a choice, and you may regret the choice, but even more so, you regret having to make that choice at all, being put in that position to make it. Also, when principle is set aside because of opportunity costs, we would hope that the cost would be in terms of another morally relevant principle or goal. So obviously we're not saying, we break a principle so we can get out of work early. We don't break a principle so we can go have fun. Okay? We compromise a principle for the sake of a more important principle. Okay. Economists all too often think of costs in terms of money. That's just a very easy thing to do. I don't think we're immune to that either. A convenient shorthand that nonetheless biases the more ethically oriented among us, the people in this room, against the idea of abandoning a principle for cost. Okay? Like I said, the idea of pricing a principle or costing a principle is anathema to us. But if we think of that cost in more general terms as what other principles do we have to sacrifice, that makes the trade-off a little more palatable. but again, I stress, not as easily accepted as standard economic trade-offs, one good for another good. Okay, so that's individual choice. Now the implications of judgment for policy making. In the same way that judgment can help people balance their duties, principles, and preferences, it can also help policymakers balance their principles with their policy goals. Dworkin's work on jurisprudence emphasizes the separate domains of the legislature and the judiciary, being policy for the former and principle for the latter. But policymakers do and should consider principles themselves when enacting legislation and regulation, okay? If only to preempt the Supreme Court doing the same thing down the road. Policymakers in the United States have to acknowledge, of course, the limitations on their power according to the Bill of Rights and subsequent legislation such as the Civil Rights Act. This is not to imply, of course, that these principles are absolute. Even the First Amendment guarantee of free speech is limited by factors such as the clear and present danger rule. This is a particular issue when the policy itself is based on principle and the preferred execution of this policy is constrained by cost. Okay, you can think of this in terms of people working in various areas of government. Okay, let's assume the very civically minded ones, the ones who got into government to do good, but find they can't do all the good they would like to do because they don't have the resources. Okay. The example I use that I've written on in the past is criminal justice, which is usually understood to be motivated and justified by at least two goals: deterrence, limiting crime, and retributivism, or punishing crime. To the extent that the authorities pursue a deterrence goal, they simply optimize the difference between crimes prevented or minimized and the resources spent. As with any utilitarian procedure, judgment is still required in estimating the cost and value of the benefits and costs, but once this is done, the rest is simple calculation, as our fellow economists of crime do every day. However, to the extent that the criminal justice system is motivated by considerations of retributivist justice, which focuses on punishing offenders for crimes committed, judgment is more crucial. Retributivist justice is at heart a deontological system. You must punish the guilty according to their just deserts. Although there are many rationales, retributivism is based on the principle that wrongdoers must be punished as a matter of right and justice. Okay, not utility, not reducing crime, not that these are not valid goals, but that's not the purpose of retributivism. As such is an idealistic system, one that cannot be practiced to perfection in the real world of scarcity. The system must make sacrifices to its ideal mission, but strict retributivists would be very loath to recommend any specific compromises. Are we supposed to punish people less than they deserve? Are we supposed to punish less people? Are we supposed to be more selective in who we punish? Do we cut deals, either to get more important criminals or just to save on resources? All of which we do, but usually retributivists would be very critical of these practices. But to a certain extent, they have to be done. There just aren't enough resources in the criminal justice system. There aren't enough resources in society to pursue an ideal, perfect retributivist program. It's impossible. Okay, I've shown this. So I've proposed to retributivists that the compromise they may be able to accept in the Dworkinian sense is if they realize that their pursuit of a perfect retributive criminal justice system is constrained by other important principles. Okay? For instance, the goal of punishing all wrongdoers according to their just deserts, which includes apprehension, prosecution, as well as punishment, is limited by civil rights. Okay? The prohibition against improper searches and seizures and other things that we do to protect the innocent from being wrongly prosecuted. Okay? We do this, though admittedly recently we haven't been doing a very good job of it. Okay? But the criminal justice system is familiar with having to reconcile these various principles that they have to pursue. Some their motivation and some their constraints. Okay, so if they acknowledge that maybe we have to let this person go, maybe we shouldn't prosecute this person, maybe we shouldn't devote resources to prosecuting this person, not because it will save the department money, but because it will allow the department to pursue a goal in pursuit of another principle. Okay, so I think retributivists would be much more comfortable compromising one principle in service of another rather than compromising a principle in service to, shoring up the budget. Which is usually what they're doing, but it's not conceptualized that way because we want to use this common currency of money for all this. But as I've said, kind of the theme of the overall talk, money doesn't sit well when you're talking about principle. Okay, so even when we talk about cost, we have to think about it as the cost in other foregone goals and principles we want to pursue, not just cost for its own sake. Okay, not so much a problem in this room, but in the profession as a whole. In terms of regulation, such judgment is often needed because many regulatory initiatives involve monetary costs and unquantifiable benefits. In his recent book, Valuing Life, prominent law professor Cass Sunstein describes the thinking behind his regulatory review during his time as administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs from 2009 to 2012. He paints a wonderfully detailed picture of a more nuanced, more humane version of cost-benefit analysis in which costs are identified and then compared to the less quantifiable benefits. Several examples he gives are improved wheelchair access to public restrooms. How do you put a dollar value on that? Okay. Reduction in the incidence of prison rape. Again, how do you put a dollar value on that? Okay. But you have to at some point because you're dedicating resources to this, resources that could be used in many other ways. You have to justify using them in this area. And Sunstein, expresses his own struggle with this in that he wants to help so many people when he was in government, but there's only so many resources. Even changing a regulation takes resources, okay? So he describes I highly recommend the book. He describes his nuanced view, his break-even analysis, saying, okay, we're going to spend so many $1 million to change this. What size results do we need to see to justify this expenditure? Okay, he couldn't even consider whether benefits exceed cost. You couldn't quantify the benefits. He'd have to consider, do the benefits justify the cost? Okay, you're obviously not going to spend $60 million to retrofit 3 restrooms for wheelchair access. Okay, but if you could spend $60 million to retrofit 300,000 restrooms for wheelchair access, those are 2 different things, right? So obviously a judgment call needs to be made in the end. Finally, national economic policy is called upon now to further many incommensurable goals at the same time, a task that demands judgment in its best execution. For example, we all know the Federal Reserve. We think of it as the 2 main goals, to control inflation, to lower unemployment. Okay? Of course, it also regulates the banking system, ideally. Okay? And now there's increasing calls recently to address inequality as well. So, inflation, economic growth, unemployment, inequality, keep them in check. That's a lot to do. And only so many, I'm not going to worry about their resources. Each goal may be quantifiable in its own way. We measure inflation, we measure unemployment, et cetera. But how do we compare those? How do we make trade-offs between pursuing one goal and pursuing the other? The convenient fiction of the misery index where we just sum the unemployment and inflation rate as if they're in equivalent units. That really makes the problem look much easier than it is. Of course, these several goals that the Fed has to pursue, or any policy-making body in the government has to pursue, can be conceptualized as principles. Okay, keeping unemployment low can be, is not just a temporary transitory policy goal, but that's a principle of a core value of government. These principles must be weighed against each other according to circumstances at the time. Okay, we always want to lower unemployment, we always want to lower inflation or control inflation. Okay, but priorities can shift at different times depending on circumstances, and they need judgment to figure this out. Okay, people who've worked in the Fed, like Martha Starr, know this. You have to balance all these goals before you can make a decision, and this takes judgment. I'm not saying I'm telling them how to make the judgments. They've been doing this all along. Okay. economists tend to think of these decisions as technical in nature. We have our macro models, and they obviously tell us, think of all the Phillips curve hullabaloo in the 60s that I've heard about, okay? They thought it provided, as we all know very well, we thought that provided policymakers a menu. They could choose any combination of unemployment and inflation along that line. And they just had to coordinate policy perfectly to do it. Okay, that made it seem so easy and technical. They learned, of course, with expectations and everything, it wasn't that easy. Okay, now it seems even more difficult and more clearer, not more clear, clearer how many of these goals there are and how incommensurable they are. Okay, so again, they've been making these judgment calls all along. I'm just saying that a deeper appreciation of how those judgments are made would be useful in understanding policymaking and regulatory procedure. Okay. In conclusion, almost done. I hope to have convinced you, persuaded you, nudged you, maybe, that judgment plays an important role in economics, and that can both improve modeling of complex decision-making as well as show the limitations of formal modeling itself. Let me finish my remarks this morning by emphasizing how this understanding of judgment goes both ways. Okay, for most of my professional career, I've been using ethics to try to improve economics. But I think the judgment also shows a way that economics can also contribute to ethics, mainly through this emphasis on opportunity cost. Okay, and take the example I gave before of retributist philosophers, that we must punish all wrongdoers according to the just deserts, no exceptions. There's a lot of ethical and political systems and philosophy that are like that, are very idealistic. Okay, which is fine. Okay, it's a good goal to aspire to, but given that you can't often pursue these ideal systems in the real world, you need to know where you can make ethically acceptable compromises for the right reasons. And I believe a system like this, again derived from Dworkin's judicial decision-making, is one way to do that. So hopefully, a model like this can help ethics and economics inform each other, which in my judgment is a good thing. Thank you. I'd be happy to take questions, except from Jonathan. No, Jonathan, go ahead, Jonathan.
Okay, Mark, that was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. David, now your question.
You've got a duty to your mother, and you've got a duty to your friend. But you're sort of distant from your mother, and you're very close to your friend. Now, you said that when these duties collide, or these principles collide, you'd have to use your judgment. But you didn't give us an answer as to how we would do that.
Right.
What I'm wondering is why you never mentioned the word moral sentiments as a way to help you around that problem.
Well, I kind of did without that terminology, because I don't want to serve your agenda, Jonathan. Okay? I kind of did when I talked about your bedrock values and principles that go beyond the vague duties or virtues or rules or principles that you learn in your ethics class or from your church or your community. But the values you place on family or friends, which if you want to characterize those as moral sentiments, that's fine. I leave that open because I don't want to specify any particular source for those. But that really enters in my Kant book, the middle chapter is about character and moral character being made up of your will and your judgment. Okay? And those two coincide in kind of a reinforcing pattern to form your character. And so when you make decisions that are going to maintain or promote or improve the moral character you're striving towards. Okay? And moral sentiments can be part of that, definitely. But I wouldn't say they're all of it. Okay. David? lightning calculators. Yeah.
But in fact, you act on tacit knowledge. That's what I said.
Right.
I can speak of irrationally choosing just because I sensed that this was the thing to do. So anyway, that's interesting, and it maybe pushed over to the non-ethical side of things, or not almost that.
Oh, right, right. And I think that was the Sullivan quote, where just through day-to-day experiences making choices, we build up a knowledge that we don't necessarily realize consciously, but that we just make decision. The whole Kahneman system A, system B way of thinking, that we make some decisions just automatically, but at one time we made them deliberatively, and we rely on that store sometimes to our detriment. This is another area that Cass Sunstein has worked on a lot, is how we build these heuristics that work over time and sometimes don't serve us in the end the way they did in the beginning.
I should also mention, I faced a Kantian moment when I came here late because I figured Tom is cheap and breakfast is expensive. So that
Yeah, Rob.
I'm going to leave my mother out of this, but in support of my friend Jonathan, are you aware, I'm sure you are, Sam Flashacker's argument about Kant and Smith having very similar notions of judgment? And in work I've been doing on Smith, where he talks about how we adjudicate among competing demands on our beneficence, it's very much along the lines you described about, and he talks about the impartial spectator procedure, but there's this whole idea of reconciling these incommensurable demands, which, whether it's love of country versus your mother or, things of that nature. So I think in terms of how we relate this to economics, Smith is an obvious avenue for carrying forward. I was wondering about...
Can I just make a comment on that first? That's wonderful. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to imply at all that this was exclusively Kant and Dworkin or Meyer's synthesis of them. I mean, you mentioned Smith, of course. I was talking to David Levy last night, and he said that Frank Knight had very similar ideas to this, and his address to the American Economic Association, not as prestigious as this, but this idea, again, is not novel, and certainly I didn't come up with any of it, but it's something that I think needs to be reinvigorated to some extent. As if anything in Smith needs to be invigorated more, but it could always be. So.
One PS on it. The verb balance. I wonder if, because it has so many connotations with utilitarianism and equilibrium, and I wonder if something more like, if you're talking about how we reconcile inconventionals, is something more like negotiating or reconciling. But the balance almost suggests that there's a common metric that we can weigh these things up.
Yeah, I see that, but in law, the courts often use balancing tests. This is where this comes from a little bit, where they're doing exactly this. But I realize, balancing kind of makes it seem like you're going to make them equal out. You're going to achieve balance. But again, in law, that's balancing tests don't do that. So, but I mean, I recognize that. Yeah, I didn't think of it that way. But yeah, it kind of a false equivalence. Good point. Thank you, Quentin. Yeah.
It also seems to me that the importance of judgment in economics, especially in the work where I come from, is very, very well recognized as well. Where I think what you were saying, what was very interesting to me, is that we don't present it in terms of a cost-benefit analysis of principles judgment.
Right, right.
Otherwise, we do it all the time. Just perhaps need to be a bit more clear about the principles underlying how we do for investment, for example, the World Bank or cost-benefit analysis. And there, this competition between principles, I think, is very important.
Okay. Thank you. And I agree with you completely. Like I said, policymakers have been doing this in one form or another for ever. But looking at it in this way, like you said, identifying the principles may be the contribution I make. So, thank you. Alan. Right, right. Yeah, there's a saying in law that hard cases make bad law. And the fact that law students spend, you know, I mean, I'm not even going to say 99%, 100% of their time studying the tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of cases that made it to the Supreme Court. The 0.00001% of cases that made it to the Supreme Court. And they take those as the, you know, as the exemplar of legal decision making, when those are, you know, the exception. Those are, you know, but taking that tiny, tiny fraction and extrapolating that this is how it applies to all of law is incorrect. So I sympathize with what you said. But again, in defense of this, we spend time looking at these because these are the interesting cases. And these are the cases that influence other simpler cases. You know, so it could be, you know, in this kind of concept of character that I developed where, you know, the will executes the judgments, the decisions of judgment, which impact the will in a circular way, and they help build and change and refine your character. You know, the decisions you make in hard and difficult moral cases are going to influence the decisions you make in simpler, more obvious cases later on. Okay? So it's kind of that thing. Let's say you feel that you haven't done enough for your parents. You feel you've been a selfish young person, haven't done enough for your parents. And you come up against some hard moral situation where, yeah, I promised my buddy I'd go to Tijuana with him, but my mom needs her to sit by her bedside after surgery. God, usually I go to Tijuana. But you know, and there's good reason to go to Tijuana. It's a yearly tradition. You know, my friends get married, whatever. So, you know, but this time I'm gonna, you know, the person I want to be is the person that's going to go sit with my mom. And that may make it become a matter of habit that I'm going to be more inclined to take care of my parents from this point on. Just in the case that the Supreme Court case, the tiny fraction of a fraction of a fraction of cases filters down and influences all legal decision making stemming from that. Okay. So, I mean, I recognize your point, but I don't want to dismiss the importance of looking at those tough cases. Elba. Yeah. Yeah. The story is usually constructed that that wouldn't work, so that the murderer would take your silence as admission that the person's here. In other words, why you know, if the person weren't here, why wouldn't you just say he's not here? So I mean, they like I said, this one tiny episode in Kant's career has been analyzed completely. Right. Well, yeah, and that's an important point that I think even Kant missed, that he'd emphasized in the rest of his work, was context matters. You know, one of the most misunderstood comments of Kant was when he said, my ethics is an ethics for Martians as much as for humans. And he just meant the very most abstract, most formal part of it, the categorical imperative. But in deriving duties from the categorical imperative, you need to know how they're going to work in whatever civilization, culture, class you're going to apply them to. Okay? So even in the simple universalization formula applied to lying, where the idea is, you know, if I propose to lie, I have to accept that everyone else can lie, and then if everyone's lying, no one will believe anybody, and lies won't work, so it's self-defeating. Okay? That assumes a lot about human nature and trust. And that, you know, because, and honestly, in real life, people lie. But we still trust, you know, in a lot of cases, we still trust a lot of people. But we realize that people do lie. So somehow the practice of lying, even though everyone can do it, hasn't defeated the essence of communication. Okay, which Kant was particularly concerned with, which is why he usually went overboard when he talked about duties not to lie. because he considered human communication to be of preeminent importance to the development of civilization. Okay, but so I mean, back to what you're saying, Elba. There's so much. What is the murderer going to assume I mean if I dodge the question, name, rank, serial number, keep quiet, squirrel, and that has to be all built in to the derivation of that duty. I mean, one of my favorite reconciliations of this is by Christine Korsgaard of Harvard, who said, if you test the maxim, which is what you test with the categorical imperative, I'm going to lie to murderers when they come to my door looking for my friend. That's universalizable. Because if the murderer doesn't know, and it gets funny at this point, if the murderer doesn't know you know he's a murderer, he won't know that you know he's a murderer and are lying to him for that reason. Like I said, absolutely right. Brilliant, clever, but beside the point when judgment takes care of the issue much more easily. Oh, it's late.
Yeah. So.
Thank you for your questions.
Yes. Thank you for your presentation and this stimulating conversation. And just to put in a little plug, we have a session called Polanyi Revisited in Salon A, starting in about 10 minutes, and I need to go set up the laptop. So thank you very much for attending this morning.